across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and I might just mention that in the second hour, we're going to be talking about what is happening in Iran, the military engagement there. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, says that they have indeed been able to destroy the Iranian Air Force. They are now conducting what are called uncontested surgical strikes. Also, when it comes to the Navy, he says that the Iranian Navy is in the Persian Gulf, and we'll get into what that might mean. 2,000 different strikes, as well as Israel striking the building at which individuals in the Iranian leadership were going to be voting on this possible successor. That building is no more, nor are they. So we will get into a lot of very important issues next hour. Also get into a couple other topics that we've been covering over the last couple of weeks on Point of View. But this first hour, we want to spend some time on this new book that has come out, From Genesis to Junia. And if you're not familiar with that name, you might grab a Bible and go to Romans 16, because we'll get to that soon enough. It is written by Dr. Preston Sprinkle. He has been on the program with us before, talking about issues like homosexuality. As a matter of fact, the most recent book we talked about was on the transgender issue. He is the president and co-founder of the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, an individual that has his PhD in New Testament from Aberdeen University in Scotland, has been an individual who has taught theology at Cedarville University, Nottingham University, as well as Eternity Bible College, and also is the president of Theology in the Raw. That Theology in the Raw podcast is available. And of course, he has an annual Exiles in Babylon conference. Preston, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on. I really appreciate it.
Again, this one is an honest search for what the Bible really says about women in leadership. But my producer and I were talking about the fact that of all the books I've read, and of course I read quite a few books because of my job, I don't think I've ever had a book where the introduction was written before the research was done. And you actually wrote that back in May of 2022, which I thought was interesting because you wanted people to, if you will, join you on the journey, because we're going to get into some issues that are candidly pretty controversial at one point or another in terms of how you perceive, for example, women in leadership. And you wanted to help people know that you came with not necessarily, I mean, everybody has a bias, but not much of a bias. You weren't teaching at an institution, for example, that mandated one view or another. You weren't in a church which had one view or another. And so in some respects, it really gave you the opportunity to maybe look at it with a fresh set of eyes. But I don't think I've ever seen a book where the introduction was written before the book was written instead of after the book was written. So I think that was something that you felt necessary just to help people understand the attempt at least having some objectivity to make sense with some of the verses we're going to be looking at.
Yeah, I haven't read a book or written a book like that either. This was the first time for me. And I came at the issue from a place where I didn't really know what the Bible said. I mean, I grew up in a context where only men could be leaders and pastors and teachers, and that made sense to me. I, read the passages in 1 Timothy and others, and, thought that was what the Bible said. And then I'd meet other people who are, biblically centered and love Jesus and very scholarly and knowledgeable, and they had a different view on that. And so I just kind of, over the years, thought, I need to dig into this topic for myself, because I'm seeing really smart, godly, Bible-believing people on different sides. And I'm, I just want to know for myself, what does the Bible say? And I get kind of obsessive with the topic if I'm going to wrestle with it. So I want to be able to read all this stuff and weigh all the arguments and work through the text as thoroughly as I can. And so, a few years ago, I did that. I took the journey. And, when I started the journey through the text, I did not have a conclusion in mind. In fact, I was quite happy with whatever the Bible says. If God says only men should be pastors and leaders in the church, then God said it, I believe it. And if he says women can be leaders too, then I'll go with that too. I really just wanted to go where the text leads as honestly as I know how.
And again, one of the things I'm going to point out is whatever you or your church or your denomination holds to, it is always helpful to know what others might have been saying on the other side of the issue. And so I guess we have a few terms to perhaps get on the table. One is complementarianism and egalitarianism, and also the idea of leadership. So just before we get into Genesis chapter 1 and work our way through the Bible, help us a little bit with some of those definitions, if you might.
So complementarian simply means that men and women complement each other, but there are role differences in the church and also in the home. Role differences where men are the leaders and they have authority, and women are not to be leaders and they are to submit to male authority. There's another brand of complementarianism that some people call soft complementarianism, and it has to do with church leadership. And soft complementarian would say that women should, gifted and qualified women should teach and preach, but they must do so under the authority of all male elders. Mm-hmm. So you still preserve some kind of male leadership, but you do acknowledge and endorse female teachers. Then egalitarian, I don't know of any kind of soft or non-soft egalitarian. The egalitarian view just says all positions of leadership and teaching are open to gifted and qualified men and women alike.
Well, very good. Well, I'm going to work through your 10 chapters as quickly as we can in 1 hour, and that is difficulty, and you can appreciate that because it's almost a 300-page book. But Genesis certainly is the first place where I think the complementarians would say, look, Adam was created first. Eve was Adam's helper. What does that imply? And a few other aspects of that. And so help us think through that, because you take on a couple of those issues, and even the idea that he will rule over you. In some respects, you had some very significant issues to address the minute you open up the Bible.
Yeah, right out of the gate, Genesis 1 and 2. I mean, this passage it's so important. Genesis 1 and 2 is important for a Christian worldview as a whole. It establishes God's design for creation. You see the New Testament writers citing it a lot. And of course, you have the creation of man and woman, both created in God's image. And then in chapter 2 is where, you have some interesting dynamics at play that relate to our debate. As you mentioned, Adam was created first. And a lot of people say, well, that, that refers to this ancient principle called primogeniture, where the firstborn son would inherit kind of authority over the household when the father dies, and he has authority over his other siblings, which is a well-established principle in the ancient world. And I used to read the creation of Adam through that lens, and many do. But there's some incongruence that we can acknowledge. First of all, Eve is not Adam's sibling; it's his wife. There's no father who's died to pass on the authority. So there's not a one-to-one correlation between primogeniture and Genesis 2. Adam's, created, not born.
Yes.
Most of all, though, throughout, and this is what really got me, I started to think, like, is this kind of principle upheld elsewhere, where God kind of prioritizes the firstborn over?
Yeah, let me take a break, and then we'll let you finish that point, because it is significant, along with a few others. Part of this book that is just out by David C. Cook. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Ray Dalio is a hedge fund manager turned economic historian. He announced, "It's official, the world order has broken down." As I write this, I'm looking at his books on my shelf, Principles for Dealing with a Changing World Order and How Countries Go Broke, the Big Cycle. He begins by providing quotes from the recent Munich Security Conference that I mentioned yesterday. The German Chancellor warned, "The world order as it has stood for decades no longer exists." The French president agreed and said that Europe's old security structures tied to the previous world order don't exist and that Europe must prepare for war. Even Secretary of State Marco Rubio added that we're in a new geopolitics era because of the old world is gone. Ray Ray Dalio has observed that countries go through a 6-stage cycle of going between order and disorder. But that is different when we look at international relations. Much of that is driven by raw power dynamics. There are fewer agreed-upon laws, law enforcement, and adjudication. He lists 5 fights between countries: trade and economic wars, technology wars, geopolitical wars, capital wars, and military wars. The link to his post provides a definition of each of these. His argument is simple. We've experienced the first 4 of these. We're already in capital wars with sanctions and other financial tools. Most types of wars don't involve shooting, but the last stage does when military conflict breaks out. Conflict arises when the dominant power begins to weaken or an emerging power begins to approach it in strength, or both. We're living through political and economic change and must pray for the wisdom for our leaders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Preston Sprinkle. And we were talking about this idea, Preston, of a primogenitor. And again, this idea that you point out is one thing when the father dies or even the firstborn dies or something of that nature. But we are dealing with a different category, as you point out, because Eve is Adam's wife, not his sibling, definitely not his younger brother. So in some respects, that argument is oftentimes used, but it doesn't seem necessarily, from your point of view, to fit here, does it?
Well, yeah, and all I'm saying is I think there's just questions about it. We can't just assume that Adam's firstborn status reflects clearly this principle of primogeniture. There's some incongruence, but most of all, when we do see what we do see throughout scriptures, God is really fond of overturning the priority of the firstborn with, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob not Esau, Joseph not his older brothers, Ephraim not Manasseh, Perez not Zerah, David not his older brothers, and on and on and on, as Jesus says, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So at the end of the day, I don't think it's clear at all that Adam's firstborn status establishes some universal principle etched in creation that all men after Adam, because of Adam's firstborn status, will have authority either over anybody really, but over everybody in the church.
Certainly. And we could spend a lot of time on that one, but again, I think you've at least answered the bigger issue. And so I know we're going to focus most of our time and attention on the Old Testament, so I thought I'd at least pick out chapter 2 on the Old Testament because we are dealing with a fairly significant number of heroic women, and that, I think, is significant, whether it's Rahab or Ruth or Abigail, whether it's Esther or Deborah. Does seem to me that there is a very prominent role for women in the Old Testament.
Yeah, numerically, men dominate the Old Testament. For every 10 named man, there's only 1 named woman. So, men are everywhere. The patriarchs, David and Solomon and the kings and so on and so forth. But what's fascinating is when women do occur on the scene, they often play really strategic roles in carrying out God's plan of redemption. The classic example that just really blew my mind is the early chapters of Exodus. Exodus, of course, is a major turning point in redemptive history. God's going to go rescue his people from Egypt, bring them back into the promised land. And in the early chapters of Exodus, it's all women who are the ones pushing back against the Egyptian empire, and paving the way for redemption. You have the midwives in chapter 1 who resist the king's edict. You have Moses' mother in chapter 2, Moses' sister, even Pharaoh's own daughter. And then in chapter 4, you have a bit of a PG-13 scene where Moses, God's going to kill Moses because he hasn't circumcised his son. And Zipporah jumps out with a flint knife and, takes care of, the son. Did what Moses should have done and tosses it at his feet. I hope that's appropriate for me to say, but the Bible says it. So all and then in contrast, you have Moses, who's a bit scared and reluctant and, nervous and everything. And so you have this interesting contrast between Moses, the one who God will ultimately, use in mighty ways, but all these women are paving the way for God's story of redemption. And I think, in a culture that was very male-centered, that was a pretty radical claim for the author to make.
One of the other ones that people might bring up in the Old Testament is, of course, you have an all-male priesthood, and, a Wayne Grudem or somebody like that will say because the priests were to be teachers, but what's your thoughts about that? Because that's the other part of the Old Testament, which, of course, will bleed into the New Testament and all the women involved in the ministry of Jesus. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, Grimm's right there. The priests were all male. There's no exceptions. There's exceptions to the prophets, but there's no exceptions to the priests, and they were the kind of commissioned teachers in ancient Israel, and they were all men. The question is, what's the rationale for the fact that they're all men? That's one question to ask, and there's other possible reasons why they're all male. One could be, as Grudem says, that they are representing God's design and creation, that only men should be teachers. But also, Israel was what's called a patrilineal society, and meaning the institution is carried on through the male heir. And the priesthood was patrilineal. It would, you can only be a priest, not just if you're a man, not just if you're a qualified man, but if you're in the within the tribe of Levi. So, and that, carried on through the male heir. A couple things to note, though, is in ancient Israel, prophets carried more authority than the priests. Prophets carried more authority than the kings. So, and you have at least two, or actually about four female prophets, Deborah and Huldah being the most notable ones in Judges and First Chronicles. And at the end of the day, whatever you think about the 12 or the all-male priesthood, from a New Testament perspective, it's not really that significant of an issue, because in the New Covenant, we are all called priests. So whatever was going on in the Old Testament with the priesthood, it doesn't really help inform, the question of women in leadership in the New Covenant.
Which, of course, brings us to the New Testament. And again, you have a whole chapter on women in the ministry of Jesus, and you take us through women in Mark, women in Luke, women in John. And once again, you see the women are very significant. And for example, anybody that maybe watches The Chosen, you recognize that there has been an attempt to try to highlight some of those very significant women. And of course, we were just talking about the crucifixion the other day, women at the cross. You can think of all sorts of other issues along the way. But again, Jesus, in a culture that was male-dominated, in which women weren't even allowed to give testimony, or at least weren't seen to give accurate testimony in the courts, elevated women in a way that they had never seen in that culture. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely. And this is something both egalitarians and complementarians, I think they agree on a lot with the women in the Gospels. Clearly, Jesus elevated, highlighted, even used women in his ministry in ways that were so countercultural, and that really kind of, bring us back to that Genesis 1 vision that, male and female are created in God's image. So yeah, there's a lot to appreciate in the Gospels and how Jesus views women that are, almost not directly related to the question of leadership. Sometimes I think egalitarians will read too much into the stories. For instance, Mary Magdalene, she told the other apostles about the resurrection of Jesus, which she did, and that's pretty mind-blowing that God would entrust a woman with that testimony in the first century. But some people say, therefore, women should be elders. I'm like, well, no, I don't know any complementarian who's saying, like, a woman can't tell other men about the resurrection. I think we need to be careful drawing a straight line from God elevating and humanizing women to speak directly to later church leadership roles. But yeah, there's some really interesting things going on with how women are presented in the Gospels that I think they do at least raise some questions about women in leadership. Are these women simply being faithful and being used by God, or are they modeling kind of leadership traits that we would want to see among any kind of church leaders? So I'll let my audience go read that chapter to see how I wrestle with that question.
Well, I think so. And again, one of the questions that people would have is, okay, women certainly are there, and are they considered leaders? And again, you raise that question in the chapter as well, don't you?
Yeah, I say the Gospels aren't directly answering the question of church leadership. The closest we do come, though, is in Mark chapter 10 and parallel passages where James and John want to have authority in Jesus' kingdom, and then Jesus gives this really beautiful radical statement that, the Gentiles lord it over you, but it's not going to be this way in my kingdom. The servant is going to be greater than the one who serves. And he highlights this trait of serving as a key trait of leadership and authority in the kingdom of God. And then that's, and nothing I'm saying there's, controversial. What's interesting, though, is when you look around in the Gospels and say, okay, well, who is serving? Well, Jesus is serving. We see angels serving. But in Mark's Gospel, and it's similar in Luke, as far as followers of Jesus, the only people who are said to be serving are women. In Mark chapter 1 with Peter's mother-in-law, and Mark chapter 15 with the Galilean women who followed and served Jesus. So again, don't want to draw a straight line to our topic, but Jesus says very clearly, this is a key leadership trait, and we also see women modeling that. So at least it's something to wrestle with. What does it mean? What is Mark trying to tell us when he says, here's some women who are modeling this key leadership trait that Jesus identifies?
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into, of course, the early church, which gets us into the book of Acts and Romans, as well as Ephesians and 1 Corinthians, a number of passages there, and it's all part of this book from Genesis to Junia, and again, an honest search for what the Bible really says about women in leadership. Dr. Preston Sprinkle with us, and we are going to come back and spend a little bit more time digging through his book. If you'd like to know more about the book, probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to it on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
You know as well as I do that elections matter, but political change can also be fleeting. After all, no politician is America's savior. To truly make a difference, the kind that lasts, we need to repair the soul of our nation. We need to reclaim America's godly heritage. We need to restore a biblical worldview to the culture. And here's the question that I want you to ask yourself. What can I do to help restore a biblical worldview to American culture? At Point of View, that is our mission, restoring a biblical worldview and reclaiming America's godly heritage. And we invite you to partake in that mission by joining the Truth Team. Learn more about the impact you can have as a Truth Team member by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Preston Sprinkle from Genesis to Junia. And in just a minute, we're going to get to who Junia is, because I found that sometimes you say that name even among individuals that have a seminary education. They go, who? And you will certainly want to know the significance of that in the title of the book. But I thought for just a minute, since now we're going to focus most of our time in the early church, Preston, it would probably be good to put this in some kind of cultural context. The other day, there was an interesting discussion. Oftentimes said we should keep the microphones on during the breaks, because this discussion with my producer and one of our guests was about the different denominations and the views they have about women in leadership and all those kinds of things. But even as I was listening to the conversation, I was thinking, yes, but when you talk about the church, you're thinking about a building, you're thinking about steeples, you're thinking about a budget committee, you're thinking about a board of elders. But in the early church, we're really talking about house churches in which a lot of the activity was being provided by the wives there. And so many times a host of a house church, by definition, would be a woman. So some of the time that we're reading through the epistles, primarily of Paul, we have to understand the goal of what he was trying to communicate and the context in which he was communicating it. Don't you think?
Yeah, Kerby. I mean, honestly, I have a whole chapter on the first century house church and its own leadership categories. When I set out to study women in leadership, I didn't even plan on digging into that. But as I started looking in the New Testament, I'm like, I started to see a problem. I do think a lot of people bring modern categories of church and leadership to the text and then ask, the question, can women serve in these kind of positions that we have, rather than saying, what were the leadership categories of the first century house churches according to the New Testament? And were women serving in those kind of categories? And man, I discovered discovered that a lot of my view of church was very modern. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but it doesn't map perfectly well on what was going on in the first century. For instance, our main, as a Protestant, our main title is pastor, right? Like we think, can women be pastors? It's like, well, Paul only used the term pastor one time in his 13 letters to refer to a leadership position in the church in Ephesians 4:11. And the context there is just, these are gifts that the church has. He doesn't say whether or not men and not women or men and women can occupy this role. He just states the gift. He uses the term, overseer and elder also, but in only 3 of his 13 letters, he uses those terms. Paul uses lots of other leadership terms like co-worker or those who manage or care for the church is another leadership term. Or Paul's favorite term that he uses most often to refer to leader is the word servant. He most often uses the word servant to describe people, doing leadership things in the church. And so, and as you mentioned, in the first century context, if somebody owned a home and opened up their home to guests or maybe some kind of, group to gather in their home, it was assumed that the owner of the home, was providing leadership and responsibility for that gathering. And as we see in the New Testament, most of the time it's a man who owns the home, as is normal for the first century. But there is at least 4 passages where Paul or Luke in Acts refers to a woman, probably a widow, probably a wealthy widow, who was the host of the house church. And here, we're kind of exploring some implications here. But if we're like, if it is normal for the host of the home, the owner of their home, to provide some kind of leadership for the gathering, what does this tell us about these 4 women who hosted house church gatherings? We know Lydia, in Acts 16 was one of them. And man, Luke really describes Lydia with a glowing report. In fact, he names Lydia and doesn't even name the Philippian jailer. He's just the Philippian jailer. He singles out Lydia. She's obviously, supporting the believers there. She's opening up her home to believers. She already knew the Old Testament because she was a Gentile convert to Judaism before she converted to Christianity. And so at least it kind of, again, I don't think it ends the debate. A lot of these things don't end the debate, but it does contribute to our first century understanding of the roles that women played in the early church.
One of the things I like about chapter 4 is where you go into that is when we've taken trips to Israel and we've gone to Capernaum or Caesarea, or when we've taken people to the journeys of Paul, and it's Ephesus or Antioch or Philippi or Corinth or Thessalonica, you get a sense very quickly, because some of those, like Philippi and Corinth, you can kind of see where the homes might have been and everything, and you realize there's no church as we would think about a church building. There are homes, and they're home churches. And talking about all the aspect of that in chapter 4 is sort of a wonderful nugget in the midst of some of the conversation about this issue of women in leadership. But let's get to, I've encouraged people to pick up their Bible and go to Romans chapter 16, and they're going to see Priscilla, and they're going to see Phoebe, but they're also going to see Junia. And at this point, that relates back to the title of your book.
Yeah, Romans 16 is such an important chapter in the New Testament. And what's funny is most people don't even really read Romans 16. It's just like, oh, it's just a list of names and greetings. And, I took a class on Romans in seminary. I don't even think we got to Romans 16. But in the ancient letter writing practice in the first century, which, Paul's writing letters in the first century, the greetings at the end are often some of the most important parts of the letter. Yes. And in Romans 16, Paul names 24 different people who were involved in his ministry, 10 of whom are women, which in a first century context, dominated by men, that's a pretty high percentage. And he even describes more women than men doing kind of ministry work, not necessarily leadership, but being active in the mission of the church. But yeah, there's three women in particular, Phoebe, Priscilla, and of course Junia, that I just really did a deep dive, looked at every word that Paul uses to describe these women, looked at how he uses these words elsewhere, looked at the historical context. And Phoebe is fascinating because, as every scholar recognizes, Phoebe was the letter carrier.
Right.
She's, from Cenchreae outside of Corinth. Paul writes his letter to the Romans, gives it to Phoebe. She goes and travels to Rome. And, then I looked into, like, what did letter carriers do? Or were they just ancient, an ancient postman, just delivering the mail? Or was there something more going on? And there's actually been a lot written on this. Cicero, first century rhetorician, talks about letter carriers a lot. And it was typical for the letter carrier to not just read the letter to its recipient, but to, scholars use the word perform the letter. You need to use intonation, gestures. You are embodying the message and playing a role in communicating that message to its recipient. And it was common for the letter carrier and reader/performer to be available to answer questions about the meaning of the letter. So we don't know what Phoebe did when she stood before the Roman church with Paul's letter. What we do know is that Paul trusted Phoebe to be in a position where male and female believers would be, possibly call on her to explain what Paul was saying in his letter to the Romans. And so the first reader and possibly interpreter of the mighty book of Romans, one of my favorite books in the New Testament, was a woman. For the sake of time, we'll just get to Junia. She's only mentioned in one verse, Romans 16:7, but Paul says, greet Andronicus and Junia, probably husband and wife, who are highly esteemed among the apostles. There's a big debate about what among the apostles mean. Does it mean that Junia and Andronicus are highly esteemed in the eyes of the male apostles, or does Paul identify her as an apostle? Certainly not the 12, but Paul's not one of the 12. We do have another group of apostles that kind of show up in Acts. And long story short, having worked through the Greek text and the syntax and the wording and everything, I think the best reading there is that Paul does identify her as an apostle. And he even says that, she was in prison. For a woman to go to prison in the first century,
pretty amazing. They would have had to be very disruptive in a good gospel-centered way, like Paul was disruptive in various cities and Acts. And, women stayed in the same cells as men. And I'll let the audience, their mind wander about what that would have been like for Junia to be in a cell with a bunch of criminal men where there's rotting corpses, there's little food and water, and there's probably many other things she had to endure. Hell on earth, I would think. Yeah.
But when she came out, she kept apostling the church. And that's, where we land on the question of women in leadership, I think we should all sit back and say, man, we need some Junias in the church today who have just gospel-centered resilience to be able to endure that kind of thing and continue to proclaim the supremacy of Christ.
Might just mention that you go on for pages about her, so that's something that would be very helpful for people to know. We come back, we'll get into the key passages in 1 Corinthians, and of course there's so much more, but we've tried to cover at least some of the different chapters in this book. Let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Preston Sprinkle with us for a few more minutes as we talk about From Genesis to Junia. Again, is a book published by David C. Cook. And Preston, one of the individuals I met, 3 decades or more ago was Cliff Kneckley on campus, and always have watched what he does as he interacts with students. And one of the videos on YouTube that I think gets a lot of play is where a very educated young man pulls out a Bible and reads from 1 Corinthians 4:34 and 35 about the fact that women should be silent in churches. And then it's kind of like, what do you think about that? And of course, you've devoted a chapter to it, so I'd love to get your response.
Yeah. It's 14:34 to 35, where Paul says women be silent in churches. And, it's an interesting passage. It kind of jumps out of nowhere. In fact, some scholars say, I don't think Paul even wrote these verses. And there's some arguments made for that, but I think he did write the verses. I think the evidence points in that direction. But right away, when Paul says women be silent in churches, he can't mean they can't speak at all, because a few chapters earlier he said when women are prophesying and praying in church, they should wear a head covering. So I don't think Paul's contradicting himself, between a few chapters in the letter. So there's probably something else going on. Now, what I did is, I love to look up the meaning of words in light of how the same author is using them, especially if he's using these words in the near context. And it just so happens that all of the main kind of debated words in this passage, speak and be silent and submit and to learn, Paul's been using these words all along, all throughout chapter 14. And if you know anything about, 1 Corinthians 14, Paul was, addressing what was a pretty chaotic thing going on in Corinth, where,
for sure,
people were speaking in tongues with no interpreter and interrupting each other. And it was just kind of a madhouse. And right before he gets to the would they be silent passage, he's addressing people who are like interrupting prophets. And he says, make sure you prophesy in an orderly manner, don't interrupt each other. And he uses these same words, speak and be silent and submit. In fact, just a few verses earlier, he told the prophets, submit to other prophets while that prophet is speaking. Wait your turn. And so if we interpret these words in light of their near context by the same author, I think the best understanding of this passage is not that Paul is saying women don't utter a peep in church, but women, you shouldn't be disruptive while somebody else is speaking. And especially in a first century context, it would have been really unkosher for a woman to be, cutting a man off while he's speaking or correcting them and so Paul is, he's addressing a situation in Corinth where women were doing that, which is why he singles them out and tells them just don't be disruptive and interrupt somebody while they're prophesying.
And one of the things I appreciate about the fact that you are willing to dig into it is at one point you talk about studying Paul's words, speak, be silent, submit, and learn. Look at it in the larger context. And before we go on, let's just recognize that what we're trying to teach people, Preston, is what we call good biblical exegesis. In other words, look at the context. What was he saying before? What was he saying after? What was the context there when he's writing to those in Corinth, when he's writing to those in Ephesus? What kind of education did women have? What kind of circumstances was taking place in that church for the reason that was written in the first place? That really, I think, is very helpful. And again, one of the other questions I suspect some of our listeners would have is when you look at those who are in authority, we do have some very significant things in 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Timothy 3. So before we run out of time, maybe just a few comments about that as well, because that gets into, again, some of the qualifications for an individual who's going to be in a position of leadership.
Yeah, it's a really tough passage, and I devoted, it's my longest chapter, almost 50 words.
Right.
50 pages on 1 Timothy 2 and 3. And before I get into it quickly, just to reaffirm, what you said, my main goal in this book is, I lay out kind of how I'm understanding the Bible. People are going to agree, people are going to disagree. My main goal is just that we would root our views in a thorough study of the text of Scripture, even though people are going to land on different views. So that's my main goal. With 1 Timothy 2:12, where Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach nor exercise authority over a man, for so many years I just read that and like, gosh, it just all says it. Like, what else do you need to hear? Paul says they can't teach or exercise authority over a man. But that word authority in particular is notoriously difficult. This is the only time it occurs in the entire Bible, the Greek New Testament and the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And it's hardly even used outside of Paul in all the Greek literature we have. So this is a really rare, unique word. It doesn't, we have to kind of figure out what it means based on how it's used elsewhere. And I devoted a lot of time in just looking at every single time this word is used elsewhere. And in every single case, the Greek word authentein is used in a context of a master, a Greco-Roman secular pagan master,
right,
wielding kind of like dominating authority over his slave or somebody of a high social status, sort of lording it over those below them. And so if we go on the linguistic evidence we have, I don't think Paul is commanding women to not exercise a kind of like godly authority that only men should wield or exercise. But I think he's addressing a particular situation where women were not just exercising godly Christian kind of authority, but a more secular dominating kind of authority that isn't good for men to do, but it isn't good for anybody to do in the church.
For sure.
And so, I do think there's more going on in that text than, if you just read it in an English translation and don't really dig deep into it. I think there's more going on than that.
And you said it's the longest chapter, no doubt about it. But then I love the part about landing the plane, because you finished the first draft actually more than a year ago, and then said, well, I need to give it one more time. So you flew to Cambridge, spent 12 days in the Tyndale House Library, what you said were perhaps the most mentally exhausting 12 days of your life. And again, you've ended up with, I guess, an 8th and final draft of the book. And the reason I brought this up is I recognize there's a lot of controversy here, but whatever position you take, you would do yourself well to see the other side, and I think you bring back and forth between a number of individuals. If you look at the people that have endorsed your book, many of those individuals, like Lisa Harper and Craig Blomberg and Sarah Glahn are certainly there. You, of course, I think I've mentioned Wayne Grudem, and we can mention all sorts of individuals on the other side as well that fit into that. And if you are going to make a policy or establish one or reevaluate it, this is an attempt to just kind of in an ironic way look at this issue in a broader sense. And I appreciate the fact that you took the time to write the book, and I appreciate the fact that you took an hour today to talk with us about it.
Thanks, Kerby. I really appreciate it. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, and again, I would encourage people to not only check with you, they might want to have you come and speak. They might want to know more about the Theology and the Raw podcast, might want to find some of your other books. The Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, if especially you're dealing with this issue of homosexuality and transgenderism, that is something he's written about as well. This was a little bit of a deviation from some of the other things, but in some respects it fits there as well. And if you are like some of us that actually have to speak in front of an audience, many times they raise some questions like I mentioned a minute ago, one that is on Cliff Neckley's YouTube video. Well, what about this verse? What about this verse? And I think knowing how to answer those questions going to be very helpful. And that's why we do what we do. It's a program that deals with apologetics, worldview, theology, philosophy. It's what we talk about here on Point of View. But when we come back, we're going to talk about news. There's a lot going on, and you need to know about it. We'll cover that right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about, of course, our military engagement in Iran. I will guarantee that you're going to hear some things this hour you've heard nowhere else. And part of that is because I've worked to try to pull together material and information that would be interesting to you and helpful to you as well. And I sometimes smile at all the places where I get these ideas. When I oftentimes travel out there and get to meet you face to face, one of the questions I get quite often is, where do you get your news and information? Well, some of this is going to come from a news report. I see this piece here comes from a post on X. One of the pieces comes from some material that Gary Bauer has provided. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was in Dallas, and some of the things he said to show us how behind the scenes the United States is trying to actually corrupt the currency, the rial, the Iranian rial, and using what you might call dollar liquidity as a weapon. Have a piece here that we're going to talk about a little bit later that I found in Instagram. I mean, you get all the different places that information can be provided, not to mention the articles I posted. Some of them are from National Review, some are from Town Hall, some are from the Washington Examiner, one's from American Greatness. So the bottom line is, there's a lot of places to look to find this information. But let's, if we can, begin to put in perspective the extent of this military engagement, this war, whatever you want to call it. And I don't think the mainstream press has done a real good job of covering the fact that, indeed, this has been devastating to Iran. We have the Secretary of Defense, or oftentimes referred to as the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, saying that we now enjoy uncontested surgical strikes. What does he mean? We basically own the air over Iran. And so let's, if we can, put a little of that on some of those numbers in perspective. Before the war started, the Islamic Republic, its air forces divided a little bit between the Republic of Iran Air Force and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, but basically about 610,000 active duty personnel and about 350 reservists, making it one of the larger militaries in the world. It had, the best estimates were 778 aircraft, which is impressive until you realize that this was an aging fleet. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Yes, they had F-4s and F-5s and F-14s and MiGs and things of that nature, but essentially, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, has said, quote, "The Iranian Air Force is no more, built for 1996, destroyed in 2026. Probably very true. There are a few other examples. For example, there was an Israeli Air Force F-351 that was able to shoot down an Iranian Air Force Yak-130 fighter jet. So, yes, there were a few that maybe got off the ground, but this, as far as we can tell, is the first shoot down in history of a manned fighter aircraft by an F-35 fighter jet. So, interestingly enough, that is just one illustration of that as well. we also need to pay attention to the fact that we are moving very quickly, I might add, from manned aircraft to drones. So the number of drones, a much bigger issue, and the New York Times reported that Iran has fired more than 2,000 drones at enemy forces. Now, many of those have not even been fired at Americans or Israelis. There was a joke made the other day by a comedian that said when we actually came in, and Israel and the United States came in, the Iranian response was to fire drones everywhere. And the comedian, Jon Stewart, said, well, I've been in a bar fight one or two times, and when you're in the midst of a 2-on-1 beatdown, about the last thing you want to do is slap someone else's face. And that has been the case because in some respects, many of those drones have been aimed at, for example, the UAE. That's the United Arab Emirates, in which they've detected 812 drones. This is the latest numbers I have. Intercepted 755, which is very good, but it still means that 57 got through and caused damage. Kuwait, another example, they intercepted 283, but you can see that because they have been firing so many of the drones, some of them are getting through. And so that is, of course, the damage that you're seeing right now on your screens if you're watching television. Okay, let's move from the Air Force to the Navy. The Iranian government also splits its Navy into two. You have the Islamic Republic of Iran, as well as the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Navy. But again, according to Pete Hegseth, quote, the Iranian Navy rests at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, combat ineffective, decimated, destroyed, defeated, pick your adjective. In fact, last night we sunk their prize ship, the Soleimani. Looks like the president got him twice. Okay, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense to some of you. Soleimani, first of all, was the general which was taken out in the first term under Donald Trump. But the Soleimani is a new class of Iranian ship. And so they were able to take that one out as well. While we're talking about naval engagements, and then I'll take a break and get into some other aspects of this, we had an American submarine sinking an Iranian warship in international waters. Now, again, there's been all sorts of hoop and cry about that, but the bottom line is that if indeed that would be a ship that would prevent oil from coming through the Straits of Hormuz, even if it was in international waters, I think that is the case. And so one of the individuals said, the Navy has struck. Our submariners, known as the Silent Service, did the job we ask of our fast attack boats and did it textbook. So we do also have seen, some of the devastation in the UAE and a few other places, but we also have an oil tanker that has suffered an explosion off of the coast of Iraq. So we'll see where that unfolds in the future. But as I mentioned at the outset, one of the things that I first saw on X, and I've seen it now documented, is the fact that Israel first struck this particular building, and it was a building where many of the Iranian leadership gathered together to actually vote on who the successor would be to Ayatollah Khomeini. And while they were voting, Israel destroyed the building and thus those individuals. The plan has been for the new leader to be the son of Khomeini, Mojtaba Khomeini, who, by the way, was out of the country at the time, but doesn't give us a great look because nepotism almost makes it look more like the monarchy they were trying to get away from. But nevertheless, we'll see how that plays out. We come back from the break, though, where we'll get into some of the articles we've posted today, thinking that these, I think, are important issues for us to discover and to discuss. And, of course, if you'd like to join the conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Ray Dalio is a hedge fund manager turned economic historian. He announced, "It's official, the world order has broken down." As I write this, I'm looking at his books on my shelf, Principles for Dealing with a Changing World Order and How Countries Go Broke the Big Cycle. He begins by providing quotes from the recent Munich Security Conference that I mentioned yesterday. The German Chancellor warned, "The world order as it has stood for decades no longer exists." The French president agreed and said that Europe's old security structures tied to the previous world order don't exist and that Europe must prepare for war. Even Secretary of State Marco Rubio added that we're in a new geopolitics era because of the old world is gone. Ray Dalio has observed that countries go through a 6-stage cycle of going between order and disorder. But that is different when we look at international relations. Much of that is driven by raw power dynamics. There are fewer agreed-upon laws, law enforcement, and adjudication. He lists 5 fights between countries: trade and economic wars, technology wars, geopolitical wars, capital wars, and military wars. The link to his post provides a definition of each of these. His argument is simple. We've experienced the first 4 of these. We're already in capital wars with sanctions and other financial tools. Most types of wars don't involve shooting, but the last stage does when military conflict breaks out. Conflict arises when the dominant power begins to weaken or an emerging power begins to approach it in strength, or both. We're living through political and economic change and must pray for the wisdom for our leaders. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Byron York talks about forever wars or endless wars and the Iraq syndrome. What he means is that for many years in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, whenever you talked about using military force, there was what was called the Vietnam syndrome, and that is recognizing that we ended up in a Vietnam-style quagmire. There were real questions about whether or not to deploy the military in any kind of activity, and the Vietnam syndrome eventually has been replaced by what's now called the Iraq syndrome. That is, again, seen in Iraq-style quagmire in which American troops were stuck for decades in a costly war without a victory. And in some respects, what Byron York says is the president is in putting the Iraq syndrome to the test. He says if after initial military success, we are able to decapitate the Iranian leadership and take out many of its weapons, and then the United States or other countries or the Iranians themselves are able to set Iran on a stable path, then he will succeed in really banishing the Iraq syndrome forever. If, on the other hand, after some of this initial military success, Iran descends into an Iraq-style chaos with a weak and unstable government, then the Iraq syndrome will be alive and well. And he says the key phrases of the Iraq syndrome are forever wars, endless wars, and their variants. References not only to Iraq, but to all sorts of other things, including the involvement in Afghanistan, which lapsed into nation building and ended with the disastrous withdrawal by President Biden. So in some respects, that gets to my second article here by James Antle, because how Trump can avoid forever wars and a forever war in Iran, because he says certainly the president has shown his willingness to overthrow foreign leaders, not since we were able to remove Saddam Hussein, but that is something that is in the past. And now, if nothing else, this occupation now turns into what might be the next step. What is the next step? It is one thing through Operation Midnight Hammer to remove the nuclear threat from Iran. It's one thing to, in the dead of night, to remove Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela. It's certainly one thing to actually kill the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani and even the bombing of Syria. But now is the next step. And again, he says, on the one hand, Trump's ambitions in Iran seem to be sweeping, and the theatrical targeting of all of the strikes have been characterizing his use of military force. And so in some respects, that is the case. But the real issue, of course, is what are the next steps? He quotes from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who said, as the president said, we would love for the people of Iran to use this as an opportunity to rise up and remove their leaders. They've been wanting to remove them for a long time. We've seen successive waves of protest, but we've also seen them slaughter people as well. But the objective of this mission is to make sure we don't have these weapons that can threaten us and our allies in the region. That's what we're doing right now. But again, while we would like to see a new regime, he says, the bottom line is no matter who governs that country a year from now, they're not going to have these ballistic missiles, and they're not going to have these drones to threaten us. That's the objective of this mission, to deny them the ability to use ballistic missiles to threaten their neighbors, to threaten our bases, to threaten our presence in the region, and ultimately as a shield, which they can do whatever they want with their nuclear weapons ambition. And so again, we'll see where this goes, but it's again one of those questions of where Iran goes from this point, which is why I thought I would share with you something that I have not posted, because in some respects, a lot of this is coming out of some of the things I've read and maybe something I will write. But the other day, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was in Dallas, and before that, he was speaking in Davos. And if you put those pieces together, you can see that while we're engaged in a military campaign in the air, we are underneath also engaged in a way to actually begin to topple the currency of Iran. And when a currency collapses, almost always a nation collapses, and that's where we are. But let me just for a minute quote from Scott Bessent. Treasury Secretary said last month the White House announced its maximum pressure campaign on Iran, designed to collapse its already buckling economy. The Iranian economy is in disarray. 35% official inflation, and he puts in quotes because it's probably much worse than that, a currency that has depreciated 60% in the last 12 months, and an ongoing energy crisis. He says, I know a few things about currency devaluations, and if I were an Iranian, I would get all of my money out of the Iranian rial. He makes a comment there, I know something about currency devaluations. Does anybody in the listening audience know what Scott Bessent did when he was in England? He worked for George Soros. George Soros. And he was part of an organization that actually brought currency devaluation of the British pound. So when he says, I know a few things about currency devaluation, yes, he does. And yeah, the argument being made right now is, since you are finding yourself in Iran right now, Christian or Muslim, no matter who you are, maybe even a secularist, do you want the Iranian rial? No. Well, what do you want? Well, that's why they're flooding the country with dollar stable coins. And so in some respects, the government needs to be able to control the money. That's why, and even in this country, we have what are called legal tender laws. Pretty soon, most of you are going to have to pay your income tax. And if you have to pay your taxes, I'm hoping many of you are going to get a very substantial refund. But if you have to pay your taxes, you can't pay it in gold. You can't pay it in Bitcoin. You have to pay it in dollars. And if you look around the world and look through history, and I just did a series recently on the decline and fall of empires, anytime an economy has its currency collapse, then almost instantaneously the government itself collapses. So most people aren't talking about the economic warfare that we're engaged in right now. but it is pretty significant. And again, you've got to go back to when he was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he was, again, talking about that very important issue. And when, indeed, they caused dollar liquidity in Iran to dry up, they forced Iran to print a lot of money. When you print a lot of money, what do you get? Well, you get inflation. You know the drill. And that is something which affected the local economy. And here we have an individual who is part of the team that broke the Bank of England. You may not want Scott Bessent as your Treasury Secretary, a man who used to work for George Soros, but those are the facts on the table, and that's where we are in terms of dollar liquidity. But it also is affecting not only the economy, but energy. Iran roughly sends 85% of its crude oil to China. Venezuela sent almost half of its oil to China. Can you see what's happening here? We've talked about this before with Gary Bauer on Monday, but first Venezuela, now Iran. And this is not just a story about the Middle East. This is also a story about, as Gary Bauer pointed out on Monday, and even yesterday, I spent some time talking about the possibility that there were some very good articles we posted on what that might mean. This is also a very significant move this country is making on what you might call the energy chessboard. And so as a result, you're starting to see some of the impact on economies. Of course, you're going to see some of the impact on economies that need energy. And though China probably can get some energy from other sources like Russia, they can't get enough. And so in some respects, this is why this whole economic battle is taking place in a very significant way. Just before I take a break, though, I thought I'd mention one other one that I found on, of all things, Instagram. And that is the other day, the United Arab Emirates finally said, you know, we have almost 20,000 individuals that are stuck in our country. And so Qatar and United Arab Emirates have now said that for all the Americans and other foreign people stranded in their country, they will cover all the costs. That's pretty impressive, especially when you recognize Qatar oftentimes hasn't necessarily been the friend of America. They're at least trying to ease some of the pain of some of those that are still stuck in those countries. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
You know as well as I do that elections matter, but political change can also be fleeting. After all, no politician is America's savior. To truly make a difference, the kind that lasts, we need to repair the soul of our nation. We need to reclaim America's godly heritage. We need to restore a biblical worldview to the culture. And here's the question that I want you to ask yourself. What can I do to help restore a biblical worldview to American culture? At Point of View, that is our mission, restoring a biblical worldview and reclaiming America's godly heritage. And we invite you to partake in that mission by joining the Truth Team. Learn more about the impact you can have as a Truth Team member by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Let's change topics. There are so many other things to talk about, and one of those has to do with this issue of transgenderism and a decision that came down from the Supreme Court, which normally we would have talked about with one of our lawyers, but since this was from a different organization, I don't know that First Liberty could address it as much as I can, so I will. And I think it is important to point out that tomorrow we will have Holly Randall, who's with First Liberty Institute, as well as Liberty McCarter, but one of the things that I wanted you to know about is this decision that came from the Supreme Court that affects the state of California. And when we talk about transgenderism, I might just point out that we probably will produce a new booklet on transgenderism because of all the new information coming out. And that's one of the reasons why I hope that you will join with us in a couple weeks. I think it's about 3 weeks away, in which we will have our Truth Team Week. If you're not a member of the Truth Team, one of the benefits is receiving the booklets that we send out every month. The ones that are out right now are on borders and deportation, next one on declaration, and on. But certainly we will get to this issue. And the article I've posted comes from the two women that brought the lawsuit. And I'll let them tell their story. They said, between us, we have spent more than 5 decades teaching in the California public schools. We both won Teacher of the Year awards. We coached teams, mentored struggling students, and built the kind of trust with families that only comes from showing up year after year. We didn't enter education to become plaintiffs in a federal lawsuit. We entered it because we believed in children and the partnership between schools and parents. And yet, then California told us to start lying to those parents. I think you know the story, but again, for those of you that don't live in California or haven't been following this, they say under the policies enforced by Governor Gavin Newsom and the Attorney General Rob Bonta, California schools were required to conceal a child's asserted gender identity from parents, even when a student was living as a different gender at school with a new name and different pronouns. You with me on this? These policies apply to children as young as 2 years of age. We were told to participate or face consequences. As educators and as women of faith, we couldn't comply. Again, you understand the consequences here. Every time a school says we are not to tell the parents, the argument is always, well, the parents might retaliate. But I want to always bring out another point, and that is, let's take a simple one. If you have a woman, a young girl that's pregnant, and you decide that she needs to get an abortion, and you take her to go get an abortion and then bring her back without her parents' permission, what happens? Well, if there are any consequences, physiological consequences, medical consequences, emotional consequences, who has to pay for those? Oh, the parents who weren't told in the first place. Same thing. If we have children that are now thinking about maybe even having a gender-altering life, a life-altering decision, and you're not allowed to tell the parents about it, just think that through. Well, nevertheless, these two individuals, Elizabeth Mirabelli, as well as Lori Ann West, sued. And on December 2025, Judge Roger Benitez of the Southern District of California ruled that the state's parental exclusion policies are unconstitutional. He found that schools cannot hide a child's social gender transition from that child's own parents, and that teachers who want to share such information cannot be prohibited from doing so. Then they tell a couple stories. Consider what those policies did to real families. One family in our case discovered that her daughter's school had been secretly transitioning her and treating her as a boy since the start of the 7th grade. For 13 months, her mental health deteriorated while her parents knew nothing. She attempted suicide. Her parents learned the truth, not from a teacher or a counselor, but from doctors at the hospital. Even after this tragedy, school administrators continue to withhold information about their daughter's gender identification because of the California law. The daughter in another family was secretly transitioning beginning in the 5th grade. Her parents found out only because another mother let the secret slip. When they confronted the principal, they were told that the state law prohibited sharing information about a child's gender identity without the child's consent. Are you with me on this? It's hard to even think about how this has been played out. But nevertheless, these two individuals, Elizabeth and Lorianne, said our refusal to do so cost us personally. Someone broke into one of our classrooms to put up malicious posters. Students harassed us, encouraged by school employees to circulate protest videos. One of us was placed on involuntary leave after retaliatory complaints from colleagues. The other went on leave, fearing for her safety. Even after winning a preliminary injunction, we had to fight for months before being reinstated. The years-long legal battle took a heavy toll. You think? Nevertheless, on Monday night, the Supreme Court vindicated those families in a 6-3 decision. Why wasn't it 9-0? But anyway, in a 6-3 decision, the court vacated the Ninth Circuit Court stay and restored Judge Benitez's injunction for parents across California. The court's order formally applies to parents, not teachers, but the logic of the decision protects us too. If parents have a constitutional right to know about their child's gender transition at school, then California cannot punish a teacher for providing that information. They say, we refused to lie to the parents who trusted us with their children. California punished us for it. The Supreme Court has now told California it was wrong. We might talk about it again. It's probably worth a commentary, but I just wanted you to know about that decision that did come down on Monday, and I did want to certainly talk about the fact that even though we'll focus a lot of time and attention on what is happening in Iran, other things are happening. And those are certainly worthy of your information and discussion and encouragement as well. Let me, just before we run out of this segment's time, point out that our good friend Merrill Matthews told us that he had an article coming out in Newsmax, and we've now posted it. And it raises a very important question that you might want to raise with your elected representatives, because I think what you're going to find very easily, and we've reposted the page from Newsmax, so you don't have to get the magazine to find it. You can find it right there and maybe even repost it, is that after we've seen the fraud that has taken place in Minnesota and in some of the other states, I might mention California, Ohio, and a few come to mind, and also given the fact that we know, as Dr. Merrill Matthews in his most recent book has documented, fraud that's extensive in welfare, health care, and entitlement programs, we should also be even more concerned about the kind of aid that was sent to other countries through the USAID programs, much of which was shut down. Thank you, Elon Musk and Doge. But he gives you this printout, which is amazing, because let's just take a couple of countries. Of course, Ukraine is one that has received an enormous amount of money, and yet its corruption rank is 104 out of 180. Well, they're worse. That'd be Somalia. Oh, that shouldn't surprise you. Somalia received, what were we talking about, $765 million in taxpayer dollars in 2024. But if you look at the U.S. obligated aid, that's, again, just a drop in the bucket. But they're listed as 179 out of 180, probably the most corrupt country in the world. I don't know who's number 80. Oh, 180 is one right under it. South Sudan. And we've sent money to South Sudan, $755 million. And this is considered the most corrupt nation in the world. So Somalia, 179 out of 180. South Sudan, 180 out of 180. But not to be left out, how about Sudan itself? 170 out of 180. Congo, 1.4 billion, 151 out of 180. And then, of course, you can go through Afghanistan. How about Indonesia? Ranks 99th in corruption with $800 million obligated. And, of course, even Afghanistan, where a lot of our money has gone, Once again, $755 million obligated and 165th in terms of that. These are not numbers you would want to use. As a matter of fact, from his list here, only Israel isn't in the bottom third or bottom 2 or 3 in some cases. And Israel, of course, has received a lot of money, and that's supposedly controversial right now, but we'll cover that in a future program. But if nothing else, it illustrates again that we already recognize that there is fraud in Medicare and Medicaid and welfare programs. But if you think we've got corruption here, just imagine what we send overseas. This piece by Dr. Merrill Matthews, I would commend it to you, and a question you might ask your elected representatives. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention tomorrow we're going to have a chance to look at a number of very important issues. Of course, Iran will be one of those. Another one will be, and I'll hold up our booklet that we just sent out the other day to those of you that are part of our truth team, Borders and Deportation. The reason I hold that up is we've been hearing that indeed Kristi Noem is on the way out, and it has now been announced that no longer will she be the Secretary of Homeland Security. Instead, she will be replaced by Senator Markwayne Mullin, who is a senator from Oklahoma. I thought I might get some comments tomorrow from Holly Randall, since she's from Oklahoma, probably knows him. And so there are some changes that are taking place in the area of Homeland Security. We'll spend some time tomorrow talking about that, but in case you haven't been watching the news, there was a report that might take place. And it has now taken place. Let's, if we can, end with this piece by our good friend, Colonel Allen West. He is concerned as he's been watching the influence of Muslim money, primarily from Arab countries, as well as money from China, communist China, and how that's affecting some of our cultural institutions. He begins, first of all, with a quote from the leader and founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, who said, "Islam is a comprehensive system which deals with all spheres of life. It is a state and a homeland. It's a morality and a power. It's a culture and a law. It is a material and a wealth. It is a jihad. It is a call. It is a true belief or correct worship." The point he's making is some people say, well, Islam is just a religion. Well, it's that, but it's more than just a religion. It's a worldview. And there is a real deliberate attempt on the part of some who have the financial resources to have an influence on our culture. And then he quotes also from Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, "Our entire society works together in one heart and one mind." And he says, I've written and spoken on many occasions about the Marxist leftist enemy within our republic and its persistent effort to capture the hearts and minds of American families through institutions such as PBS, NPR, MSNBC, which is now MS Now, and whatever rebranded iteration of progressive media emerges next. I've also written and spoken about the creeping advance of Sharia law advanced by the Muslim Brotherhood and the expansive ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party to shape a world ordered not by liberty, by centralized control. Now, the point he's making is that we have talked about this on the program before, and I won't go into all the details, but it gives you a couple stories that we've mentioned before, and that is because of the investments that are coming from certain places. And that would be either the investments that may be coming because there's really a push right now for some of those individuals in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and others who are trying to actually buy Paramount. There is also this desire on the part of Hollywood and our cultural icons to make sure that they can sell their products in China, thus to remove anything that might be offensive to the Chinese. And we've seen this for some time. He gives a couple of examples. If you've ever seen the film World War Z, Brad Pitt is in that. It was rewritten to remove China as the origin of this fictional pandemic. Well, of course, know where one of them did come from. And he says this occurred years before the Wuhan virus emanated from the Chinese Communist Party sphere of influence. But again, it was showing how the market access affects the narrative. He says, if you look at the latest Top Gun movie, Top Gun Maverick, I didn't know this, but promotional material removed the patches of Taiwan and Japan from the flight jacket written that were actually worn by Tom Cruise, the protagonist, in order to probably avoid offending some of the Chinese regulators. And then he talks about, CNN gives us some examples there. CBS, he reminds us again how CBS actually completely edited the interview they did with then Vice President Kamala Harris because of the fact that she just had this rambling answer and eventually settled for a $16 million judgment against them, which is pretty amazing. And then he talks about the fact that we are seeing more of the concerns. He says reports indicate that sovereign wealth funds from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates have committed approximately $24 billion in support of Paramount's bid. And so, again, what kind of influence would that have? Again, he says, let's just recall the comment that I just read a minute ago of the ideological declaration of the Muslim Brotherhood's founder, who described Islam as a comprehensive system governing culture and law. And he says, add to this the well-documented record of the Chinese Communist Party and the attempts to, again, condition and even censor or manipulate the kind of narrations and the kind of programs, the way in which sometimes films are edited, storylines are softened, imagery is adjusted, and talks about some of that as well. And the question he really asks at the end of his piece is, why is there no sustained national debate? Why are policy makers not demanding transparency regarding the influence accompanying this capital? Why are Americans expected to regard this as kind of a routine consolidation? Because he's talking about the various kinds of consolidation that would take place with everything from Warner Brothers and as well as Paramount and the rest. And again, he's raising some current concerns about the issue of culture. And he also says that one of the famous phrases, which Andrew Breitbart has used, and we've used it here all the time, is politics flows downstream from culture. Or, the way I oftentimes put it, culture is ahead of politics. Change the culture, oftentimes you can change the politics, because culture and politics are kind of interchangeable and they affect one another in very significant ways. So it's a good piece just to remind us that we should not only pay attention to policies and laws and programs, but even what's going on in the cultural sphere. And so he asks a very good question: who owns the American story? Especially as we talk about America's story in this 250th anniversary. So I do commend it to you. It's a good piece by Colonel Allen West about the influence of culture on our world as well. Just as we end, let me mention that we still have an opportunity for you, if you have not contacted your two U.S. senators, to support the SAVE Act. SAVE Act stands again for Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility, and this is a requirement for voter ID. While we're in the midst of these midterms, I think we're going to provide more than a few examples of some problems, some difficulties, some irregularities, we might say, in terms of how people vote, and that's why we think this is so important. So, nevertheless, if you have not contacted your two senators, we encourage you to do so. It's very simple. Just simply click on that button that says Act Now, Take Action, and then we give you a suggested letter. It's 3 paragraphs long. You can modify it how you want, and then you can click the button that says Send, Or if you'd like to do it the old-fashioned way, hit the button that says print, and you can mail it to them. Either way, it's a way in which you can contact your senators, and I would encourage you to do so. Again, hope this has covered some stories, I'm sure it has, that you have not heard anywhere else. That's why I would encourage you to continue listening to Point of View. Pray for us. Hope you can support us as well. Once again, thank you, Megan, for your help engineering the programs. Thank, again, Steve for help producing the program. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on our Friday weekend edition right here on Point of View.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give 347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.